Makahanya haramita shingyo Genji Saiboza Gyojin Hanya haramita jishoken gon Gai gudo esai gu yaku shari shiki.
Picture number 8, Both Bull and Man Forgotten. Welcome back to this series of talks on the series of 10 bull herding pictures, sometimes also called the ox herding pictures. We're now coming to the last few pictures in this series, and perhaps it's a good opportunity just to recap a little bit and remind ourselves of the journey that we've been undertaking. This is a spiritual journey, obviously, but it's a journey about the transformation of consciousness as well, showing the various stages along this path, the path of the Zen training. Zen training, of course, being very much squarely within the Buddhist tradition too. And if we remember, we started these pictures just with our first protagonist, the herdsman. The bull wasn't visible. Then finally he did appear, come into the picture by picture number 3. And gradually they began to form a relationship where they came closer and closer and closer until finally, once again, the bull disappeared, leaving the man. But this time, as different to the first pictures, the bull and the man had become integrated together. And we said last time that now we were embarking upon a much more religious path, which we, up until now, the practice had been fairly squarely psychologically based. Obviously, Buddhism is a religion. We revere something. There's a power that's greater than ourselves. We don't call it God. It's the Dharma. And the Dharma is inherent in everything. In living beings, it's the Buddha nature. And of course, this spiritual transformation is the gradual realization of that inherent Buddha nature. And with this picture now, picture number 8, not only has the bull been forgotten, as in the last picture, but the man also has been. And we're faced squarely with this empty circle. In calligraphy, we come across these figures, these empty circles. You may have seen some of them, called enzo. Which represent this state of emptiness, also known by the Japanese term mu, which often translates as no or nothing, and was made perhaps most famous by Zen Master Joshu, when a student approached him and asked him, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" And Master Joshu replied, "Mu," meaning no. But another time, another monk came and asked Master Joshu, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" And Master Joshu replied, meaning yes. So the question is, what's Master Joshu up to? Does he know? Does he not know? Well, of course, according to Mahayana teachings, according to the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, all beings have the seed of Buddhahood, known as in Sanskrit as the Tathagata Garbha. And it was from this Indian Mahayana teaching of the Tathagata Garbha, known as the Buddha seed or sometimes the Buddha womb, that the Chinese developed the doctrine of the Buddha nature, which runs through all Chinese schools of Buddhism, including Chan, including the Zen school. And obviously, both these monks had heard about this teaching. But why was it that Master Joshu said no to one and yes to the other? Well, we have to remember that, of course, the teachings are always in accordance with the capability of the student. And are remedial, as Master Rinzai says in one of his sermons. Nothing I teach is absolutely real. Everything is medicine to cure specific ailments. And this is why the teacher's job is so difficult, because the teacher really must thoroughly know the one who stands in front. and in that way be able to apply the best medicine. And if that teacher can't, and sometimes that does happen, it may be that the affinity links between teacher and student are not there. It's no fault of the teacher, who may be perfectly competent, and it's no fault of the student either, who also may be perfectly competent. It just might be that the affinity links are not there, the chemistry is not there, and usually the master in that situation will send the student off to go and find someone else. But we digress slightly. So we see actually with this teaching that even when it comes to it, sometimes even the fundamental Buddha's teachings will be thrown out. This has traces of Master Rinzai's "If you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. If you meet the patriarchs, kill the patriarchs," and so on. Again, we need to be really careful with these things because, of course, Buddha and patriarchs probably don't mean all that much to us here in the West. It's all rather new, and so we can pick it up and lay it down, and it doesn't really mean much to us in our heart, not so much. But if we were to take our highest ideals, then, well, that would be... And then Master Rinzai says, now kill that. Would I feel so comfortable about it? There's a famous contemporary story. In the 1950s, Zen became very popular in the US, and there was a lot of interest in it, particularly through writers like D.T. Suzuki and one or two others. Obviously, there were the beat poets as well. And people were interested in Zen. And the story goes that a couple wanted to go and see how Zen was in Japan, in one of its native countries. And so off they went, and they found themselves at a fairly sort of ordinary Zen temple, nothing special, run by an incumbent priest who was no great Roshi or Zen master or anything, just an ordinary priest. And they asked if they could be shown around. And he said, yes, of course. So, as is customary, they started off in the shrine room, and he said, and this is where we do the chanting and first thing in the morning. And he bowed to the Buddha Rupa, the standing Buddha there, and then he went through to the Zendo and said, and this is where we sit Zazen, and there was a Bodhisattva there, and as he walked past, he bowed, as he always did, as was the form. And then he took them in and said, and this is the sort of community room, the library, a few books, and of course there was a little Buddha Rupa up on a shelf, and as he walked past he just bowed and carried on walking. And in the kitchen there was the kitchen god, and he just bowed as he walked past that too. And even when they went to the ablution room, there was a little bodhisattva there, and he bowed as he passed there. And at this point one of his sort of Western guests couldn't contain himself anymore. He said, "What are you doing? Bowing and scraping before all these images. Goodness me, I thought Zen was supposed to be above all this sort of thing. Groveling before these images, superstitious, idol worshipping nonsense. Really, I'm surprised to see this in Zen. To be perfectly frankly," he said, because he was pretty riled by all this. He said, frankly, he said, I could spit at them. Now just think of that. This is a priest who is the incumbent of this temple. All he ever knew was Buddhism, Buddhism, Buddhism. The chances are his father was the priest before him, and his father's father was the priest before him. When he would have been ordained as a boy, after his schooling, he would have gone up to the training monastery, and there he would have had a pretty tough time, come back, been reordained again as a priest. His whole livelihood depends on this, and suddenly these two foreigners come in and saying, one of them saying, I could spit at this most revered symbol, the Buddha himself. And the old priest, in his broken English, says, okay, he says, you spits, I bows. Now, here we have somebody who truly has seen into this empty circle. Because when we look at the verse that goes with it, it says, When all worldly wanting dropped away, holiness too lost its meaning. Do not stay at a place where Buddha is, and pass quickly by where he is not. If one remains unattached to either, not even 1,000 eyes can spy him out. Holiness to which birds consecrate flowers is shameful. What we have here, in fact, is another formulation of that very first teaching the Buddha gave, the teaching of the middle way, the avoidance of the extremes, in this case, the avoidance of all pairs of opposites, in particular, the opposites of me and you, or I and other. That whole split, that whole complex, that whole delusion of I has now, that bundle of I has been fully and completely laid down. And so this vista can now open. And it appears again and again. I mean, again, Joshu's yes and no is an example of that middle way. Another one is, for example, Master Tokusan, who said to his students, if you speak, you'll get 30 blows. If you cannot speak, you will get 30 blows. And this teaching of the middle way appears again and again. The six patriarchs, before thinking of good and bad, what is the true face before father and mother were born? Here, with both bull and man forgotten, we are now beholding, at least symbolically anyway, that true face now. When all worldly wanting has dropped away, holiness too has lost its meaning. And of course we need to be careful, because that holiness too becomes, or can easily become, an attachment. The story goes again of the old master who's on his deathbed, and his most senior student, to whom he is passing on the succession, is by his side. And the senior student is slightly concerned whether he is fit and proper to take on that very important role. And so he's questioning his old master, saying, do you honestly think I am ready? And the teacher looks at him and says, well, he says, your insight is sufficiently deep, and your form is sufficiently strong. He says, I think so. And then he pauses, and a doubt creeps across his face. He said, and then he replies, there is just one thing, though. Yes, master. What is it? Quickly, please tell me. Well, he says, you do stink of Zen. And that stink of Zen, obviously for a Zen practitioner, is that over-reliance on that holiness, or perhaps having become a little bit too attached to holiness. In the end, everything has to go. The Buddha's teachings are always pointing towards that letting go, that complete letting go. As one old master said, cultivate the heart that doesn't settle anywhere. And we may think that actually our hearts don't settle anywhere, or at least when we're meditating it might feel like that, because our hearts seem to be all over the place, chasing after this, that and the other. But that's not the same thing at all. Being pulled left, right and centre by wanting and not wanting and so forth, this is precisely the attachment that the Buddha's talking about. We get dragged along by these things. The heart that doesn't settle anywhere has a much lighter touch. The consciousness is open, it's airy, it's light, it doesn't push anything away, and neither does it fall into great holes and get stuck in them either. And a little bit along the path, particularly when some insight does arise, this can also become something of a danger. There is that danger, and we've seen it here in the West as well, that now I don't have to follow the rules anymore. I'm liberated from these things. And this is a question that also came up in the East as well, and was warned about. There's the story of the great master Hyakujo, another great Chinese Zen master. And once in a while he used to hold a public talk, and those talks were always very well attended. And he noticed that there was an old man who used to come in to the talk just before he started, and would always slip out just as Master Hyakujo had finished. But one day the old man stayed behind, and once everybody had gone, he came up to the master and said to him, "I would like to ask a question." And Hyakujo said, "What is it?" And he said, "Well," he said, 500 years ago, I used to be the incumbent in this monastery where we are now. And one day, a monk came up to me and said, is a man of the way," and this means an enlightened man of the way, "is a man of the way free from the laws of birth and death?" In other words, free from karma and its consequences. And I replied to him, yes, he is free. Now we may think, well, what does that mean? Well, karma, if we remember, is the teaching of one of the inherent laws of causality in our world. That if we act in a certain way, there will be certain results. And karma is always dependent on intentional action. It's in our intentional actions of body, speech, and mind that produce karma, and that cause us to be bound onto the wheel of life, cause us to sink into our habits, cause us to be dragged along, and cause us the creation of desire bodies and hatred bodies, and the body of the delusion of I as well. We've gone into all this already. And what the monk was asking is whether the enlightened man somehow stood apart from all that. And the master had replied yes. And the problem with that answer is that, first of all, it posits two things. It posits causality, a law of causality, and then one who is separate from that, and that's two things. So actually we can see that that's not really going to be quite right. There's something not quite right there, because here we are with both bull and man forgotten. Do we see two things? No. Do we see one thing? No, we don't. There's nothing there at all. It's quite empty. Things are just as they are, but yet they are quite empty. And so it doesn't quite sit squarely with that answer. And what that can lead to also is precisely the error that happened with in some areas in the West as well. That suddenly now, having had some bit of an insight, suddenly I don't have to bother with the rules anymore. There is no right, there is no wrong, and I can do what the heck I please. And then it all goes very wrong because, of course, the impulses of my secret desires and my secret prejudices immediately, the little maras, we might say, immediately leap into that vacuum and very quickly fill it up, and all sorts of terrible things can happen. And anyway, we only have to look at religious history to see what can happen when it really gets let off the leash. So what we forget, of course, is that many of those rules of good behavior and so forth are not arbitrary. Although we have lists of commandments and precepts and all the rest of it, actually these are expositions or manifestations of our inherent human nature anyway. Ultimately, and certainly in Buddhism, it's viewed that those precepts, the guiding principle that produces the precepts, already pre-exists in the heart, and that these rules only appear outwardly, but their true source is already within our own nature. And the reason we don't have to follow the rules is the same reason that lions and tigers and birds, they don't have any written rules either. And yet, quite clearly from their behavior, they have a certain choreography. They have a certain way of behaving that they all quite naturally follow. When it comes to mating, when it comes to claiming territory, when it comes to fighting and so forth, even when it comes to fighting. You go and have a look at two male lions fighting over territory, and you'll see that they go through a choreographed dance. That's not to say it can't be very cruel or even deadly. It can be. But more often than not, it's not deadly. There'll be some injury because the fighting has to take place for territory. However, it doesn't go berserk. It doesn't now wipe out huge swathes of countryside and destroy and burn everything in sight. That's what happens when we get cut off from those innate rules, from those inner rules. So this is the problem with that answer that the old man gave. And the old man went on, now realizing his mistake, and said, because of that mistake, I myself have been bound up into the body of a fox for 500 incarnations, and I've now come to the end of that series of incarnations, and I'm ready to be sprung out of it, and I would like the master to say a turning phrase, please, to help spring me out. And I would like to ask a question. And Hyakujo nodded. And so immediately the old man asked the same question. Is a man of the way free from the laws of birth and death? And Hyakujo immediately responded, he does not obstruct them. You can see that actually that's a very different answer from the first one is free, and from the second one, from Master Hyakujo, he does not obstruct them. What does he mean by that? Well, what he means is that Master Hyakujo is that the man of the way does not pick and choose. He is not selective about his experiences. In other words, if there's a situation that he likes, he can say yes to it. If there's a situation that he doesn't like, he can say yes to it. He does not discriminate between one and the other. He sees perfectly clearly that one is and one isn't. He knows exactly the difference between up and down. He knows the difference between left and right. He knows the difference between good and bad. And he knows the consequences of his actions too. But he does not willfully avoid things or willfully chase after other things, thinking that they will provide him happiness. This, of course, is going right back to those Four Noble Truths which the Buddha taught. Suffering, and that the cause of suffering is precisely this sort of sticky attachment, precisely this sort of picking and choosing, always wanting things my own way, not willing to be able to give a few things up, to realize that we have the strength to be able to bear the vicissitudes of life as well. So when all worldly wanting drops away, holiness too lost its meaning. Do not stay at a place where Buddha is, and pass quickly by where he is not, which might sound rather peculiar. Surely we should stay at a place where Buddha is and pass quickly by where he is not. Well, it doesn't say to avoid the Buddha, first of all, and neither does it say to avoid the places where the Buddha is not. And perhaps in some ways this is pointing a little bit to the tendency in some, which has happened, to decide, well, really, I want to be a Buddhist, but I'm not in the proper job for it. Perhaps I should go and work for a charity, or perhaps I should go and work in a caring profession or something. I work in a shop, or I work in Starbucks or something like that, and that's not really the right thing. I get these sort of grand ideas and the great ideals, going out saving the world and so forth. And that sort of thing we need to be a little bit careful about, because again, what we're doing is we're placing Buddha within my own idea in certain places, and was saying it in other places Buddha is not there. But actually, the Mahayana Sutras are very clear, like the Diamond Sutra, which says that all things are Buddha things. And quite often, we also hear in the chanting too, the Buddhas of the 10 directions. The 10 directions is just a shorthand way of saying everywhere, in all directions, wherever we look, there is a Buddha thing. All things are Buddha things, including oneself, of course. The Buddha nature is equal and even, neither high nor low. It's not low in Starbucks and high in Amnesty International. All things are Buddha things, even in the most repellent to me, to the most repellent of places, there is a Buddha thing. And to be able to realize that, that's not an easy thing. I tend to always be painting the world in these colours of like and not like, high and low, things that I veer towards and other things that I shun and walk away from. And it's precisely this sort of partiality that gets us into a mix. And Zen is very strong on stamping down on this, precisely this sort of thing, as being the initial problem. And particularly when it comes to consciousness too. There are aspects of ourself, of our consciousness, that we don't like, certain feelings, certain moods, certain types of thinking that I don't like, that irk me, and yet we have to learn to bear them. And in so doing, we cultivate the stamina to be able to bear them as well. So do not stay at a place where Buddha is and pass quickly by where he is not. If one remains unattached to either, not even 1,000 eyes can spy him out. And there's a nice story of Master Obaku, who was the teacher of Master Rinzai. And Master Obaku founded a monastery on a mountain top and had 1,000 students. And the mountain deity wanted to pay his respects to Master Obaku, and so came along to the monastery, but was completely unable to find him, despite the fact that Master Obaku ran the monastery and lived the monastery and rarely ever left it. The mountain deity explored every single nook and cranny, not only in the monastery but also on the whole mountain, and not once could he see Master Obaku. Well, there you are, leaving absolutely no traces. Interestingly, the Japanese term for a monk is unsui, which means cloud and water. And this really encapsulates the qualities, the virtues, if we like, of the monk, that the monk should go about as if he or she, a monk can be male or female, he or she were little more than cloud or water. In other words, leaving no traces. And it's quite a good habit, actually, particularly if we go somewhere else, to get into the habit of leaving it exactly as we found it. So if we go to work, if we're at work and we make a coffee, when we finish the coffee, to wash up the spoon and the coffee cup and wipe the surfaces down, dry them, put them away in the drawer or back in the cupboard, as if we had not been there. And the same when we go about too, to walk quietly so as not to disturb, so the doors can be closed quietly, not to tramp about noisily. A good monk would never dream of doing that. They go about creating as little fuss, as few ripples as possible. Unsui. If we really take that as a part of our daily life practice, that will do a lot to strengthen the form side of practice and cultivate that strength of holding together. Because, of course, when the passions flare, maintaining that unsui is not so easy. And so in persisting in making that right effort, we cultivate a lot of bearing strength, a lot of inner strength, which stands us in good strength when those problems in life arise, because then we can also continue to hold together. Finally, the last sentence: holiness to which birds consecrate flowers is shameful. Well, this refers to a story, an old Chinese story of a guru who was so holy and so famous that the birds used to come and drop flowers on him, and people came to visit from miles around, and to come and hear his sermons and ask his advice. And a Zen master got to hear about this, and he thought there's something not quite right about this. So he went to see the guru. Sure enough, there were the birds dropping these flowers onto him. And the two sat down and they got into conversation, and actually they got on like a house on fire. Really, really well indeed. And after a couple of hours of talking, the guru made his excuses, and because he wanted to go to the loo, so he disappeared off into the bushes. And whilst he was gone, the Zen master picked up a piece of chalk off the ground and wrote the Chinese character for Buddha onto the rock where the guru had been sitting, and went and sat down again. A few moments later, the guru appears, climbs up onto the rock, and is just about to sit down when he realizes he's about to plonk his backside down onto this character of the Buddha. And suddenly he stops like this because he couldn't do it. At which point the Zen master roared at him, "What are you waiting for?" And almost like suddenly being woken from a dream, the guru plonked his ass firmly down onto that Chinese character for Buddha, realizing his mistake. And now, having been knocked out of that, suddenly, never again did those birds drop flowers onto the guru once more. And we may think, oh, that's a real shame, isn't it? You know, those nice birds dropping flowers, and that never happened again, all because of that horrible Zen master. But really, when we look at it a bit more closely, there is something that's not quite right about that. It's all right for the gods to have flowers dropped on them by birds. This is a common motif. But to be honest, for a human being to think he is a god is a dangerous thing, a very dangerous thing. Suffers an inflation, thinks he's outside of the norms now and can do whatever he wants. And most terrifyingly, he no longer feels any connectivity, any connection with his fellow human beings. And that's when the inhumanity begins to creep in again. So, yes, even holiness must drop away. And here we have it, both bull and man forgotten, the whole thing swept out clean. And we may think now, well, that's it, surely the curtain goes down on this. But this is only picture number 8. This is not the end. We may have, even here, we must not stay. Do not stay where a Buddha is and pass quickly by where he is not. So this is not a place to dally. It's merely a staging post. There are 2 more pictures left, and we will look at those in due course. So I think for now, we'll leave it there.